Hey everyone, Dr. L here with your week 11 virtual lecture. And the room might look familiar to you because I am actually in our Thursday evening class before week 10 doing my recording. So it should look familiar, and depending on what time you arrive in class, you might even hear yourself walk in the front door of our classroom. All right. But without further ado, I want to make our week 11 videos. So I'm going to go ahead and get that PowerPoint going. So this week we're focusing on relationships, marriage, and family, as well as our chapter on religion. Today for the virtual lecture, I'm going to do announcements, review from chapter 12, as well as lecture for chapters 14 and 15, ending in the exit pass reminders section. Just as a final reminder, you should have a grade for your midterm exam on eLearn with feedback from me, or an email covering, what you need to do in order to do revisions, or maybe I wasn't able to access all or part of your project. So just make sure you're following up with me as needed. And if you have a score, but you still want to do revisions to earn back a couple of points here and there, let me know, because I'm not going to know to go back and regrade your assignment and give those points back that you've earned unless you tell me. Don't forget, you got that group project to keep working on. And if you need to make up any Thursday night classes that you've missed, you can always go to the Our American Journey exhibit here on our Dayton campus in Building 11 and complete the scavenger hunt worksheet and then submit that to me. If you're interested in doing that, email me. And I actually took a picture of their office hours recently so I can give you more information about when they're open. And then, of course, come prepared this coming Thursday to ask questions or provide comments on things that you may want to discuss regarding our class. As far as exit pass goes, I'm making this video before our in-person class session on week 10, so I don't actually have any updates for you yet, but I will make sure that when we have our in-person session this coming week, week 11, that if there are any pertinent exit pass questions, I will have that for you. All right, so let's dive into review on chapter 12, where we focus on gender and sexuality. I always like to sort of give you the big takeaways of what I hope you remember from a particular unit after our class is over at the end of the semester. And so for chapter 12, when we're focusing on gender and sexuality, I really want you to be able to walk away from this class knowing the distinction between gender and sexuality, because oftentimes these terms get conflated as the same thing, or people get confused on what the differences are in a sort of lay audience setting. So sex is rooted in biology. We're thinking about reproductive organs, and gender is a social construct based off of cultural distinctions. And again, that's based off of cultural distinctions from the sex you were assigned at birth. So there's some connection, but they are not always inherently connected. So sex is biological, gender is socially constructed, and neither of those identity categories are binary. We tend to think sex is male, female, and gender is man, woman. But in reality, those two identity categories exist on a spectrum. There are multiple options. And that's one of the things that is sort of front and center in chapter 12 that you should have read for week 10. Hopefully you also remember stuff about gender identity, or a person's deeply held internal perception of their gender, as well as sexual orientation, a person's physical, mental, emotional, and sexual attractiveness to a particular sex, male or female. And we dove in a little deeper last week on the LGBTQ plus community more broadly by completing an in-class activity that you earn points for during our week 10 in-person session. So hopefully that was meaningful for you, and you sort of remember that as well. All right. Gender roles, doing gender, and our understanding that sexuality is a social construct. These are also key terms from chapter 12 that I hope you remember, but these are sort of overarching ideas that we've been discussing since the beginning of the semester, because intro sociology classes are really rooted in this idea that race, class, and gender are a part of our everyday lived experiences on that micro scale, and they also heavily influence social institutions on a macro scale, right? And so thinking about gender roles and how we sort of socially understand how men and women should behave, thinking about this idea from Weston Zimmerman of doing gender, we apply gender to all these different aspects of our social world. And thinking about sexuality as a social construct, those are things that you should be continuing to think about both before and after our unit on gender and sexuality, where you read chapter 12. And then finally, to sort of tie all this together and help visualize this idea that gender, sexuality, and all the identity categories associated with those terms exist on a spectrum and are not inherently connected or, influencing each other. We have this gender unicorn figure here, right? So this idea that gender identity, gender expression, sex assigned at birth, who someone's physically attracted to, and who someone's emotionally attracted to, those things exist on a spectrum. They're not either or binaries, and they aren't necessarily connected. That's what this image is getting at. All right, so let's go hop into lecture on new material, starting with chapter 14. I'm going to start with an overview of relationships in marriage. So marriage is a legally recognized contract between two or more people in a sexual relationship who have an expectation of permanence about their relationship. Marriage is something that in pretty much all cultures and all countries, there is some sort of legal binding to it. Versus cohabitation is the act of a couple sharing a residence while they are not married. Now, in some countries, including the United States, if you cohabitate with a romantic partner long enough, then sometimes there's what we call quote unquote common law marriage. And so you might have some legal rights even if you aren't legally married. Then we transition into learning about the second shift. This is a book written by Arlie Hochschild. And so she theorizes sort of after the women's liberation movement of the 1960s and the 1970s, what does a woman's role look like in a family unit, in a relationship where there are children involved, now that there's more expectations that she's going to be working full time? So because of the women's liberation movement of the 1960s and 1970s, more and more women start entering the workforce, and they tend to take on full-time jobs. So they're not caregivers full-time of their children anymore. She wanted to know what the dynamics looked like. Were there changes in household responsibilities and childcare responsibilities because of this phenomenon? And so in the late 70s, early 80s, she started doing intense, in-depth ethnographic studies of family units in middle to upper middle class families across the country. What she found is that the unpaid housework and childcare that working mothers perform, still that burden falls heavily on women even after their paid full-time workday is over. And so rather than sort of more equitably sharing the distribution of that labor, because both partners are now working full-time jobs, we see women still really carry the brunt of that. And in fact, if we think about the gendered nature of different chores around the house, a lot of the chores that have historically been coded as masculine, like taking out the trash or taking care of the lawn, those are not chores that are urgent. If you wait a few days or even a few weeks to mow your lawn, it's not the end of the world. If you wait a couple of days to take out the trash, it might be a little gross and stinky, but everyone in the family unit, your basic needs are still going to be met in terms of food and cleanliness when you're out at school or work and that sort of thing. Versus the types of household chores that have historically been coded as feminine tend to be very urgent. You have to feed your family every day, 3 times a day, especially your children, right? Maybe your husband can fend for himself, but you got to feed the kids, right? And so that is a very urgent task that has to be completed. You can't put off feeding your family for a day or two, right? Similarly, you got to send your kids and yourself off to school or work in clean clothes. So doing the laundry is one of those urgent chores that has to be done regularly. Maybe you can put it off for a day or two, but that's kind of pushing it, right? And so there's a sense of urgency related to household chores that women are still expected to do versus the ones that men are expected to do, at least when we think about traditional gender norms. There's a little bit more leisure there. And then finally, kinship is a person's traceable ancestry by blood, marriage, and or adoption. So again, thinking how that ties into relationships and family. Family is a socially recognized group of individuals who may be joined by blood, marriage, or adoption, and who form an emotional connection and an economic unit of a society. Now, Especially in modern 21st century societies in Western countries like the United States, we often hear this phrase chosen family. That might be people that you live with and you operate as a family unit, but you're not necessarily connected by blood or marriage. And so, one of my favorite examples of this is the television show The Golden Girls from the 1980s. It's four women living in a household, operating as a family unit, but only two of the main characters of the four are related by blood. So, there's a mother and a daughter. And so, it's interesting because there's an episode where one of the women has surgery and she wakes up and she's asking the nurses and the doctors at the hospital where her girls are. And they think that she's referring to her kids. And they're like, oh, your daughter is on her flight here. She's going to be here in a couple hours or whatever, they say. And she's like, no, my girls. And she's referring to the women she lives with who are her chosen family. She lives with them, but they're not related to her by blood and they're not married to her. So we can also have chosen family. And then from there, we sort of have two major distinctions of family types in Western societies. So we have extended family, which is a household that includes at least one parent and child, as well as other relatives like grandparents, aunts, uncles, and cousins, versus a nuclear family, which is much more common in the United States, is two parents, traditionally a married husband and wife, and children living in the same household. If you think back to when we were talking about the American dream a couple of weeks ago, sort of the American dream is, mom, dad, 2.5 kids, a dog, and a white picket fence, right? In a lot of other countries, especially Eastern countries, we tend to see extended families be more common, where you might live in a household unit with not only your parents and siblings, but also aunts, uncles, grandparents, that sort of thing. For example, in Hawaii, where I did my PhD, there tends to be more extended family living together because there's a lot more Eastern culture and cultural influences there compared to the mainland, where we tend to see nuclear families much more common. And then in chapter 14, we get into some different theories related to family and marriage. And so Family Life Course is a sociological model of family that sees the progression of events as fluid rather than as occurring in strict stages. When we think about different aspects of what family units look like and patterns related to family units as a social institution. Versus family life cycle is a set of predictable steps and patterns families experience over time. And then finally, in chapter 14, your textbook authors talk about intimate partner violence, which is violence that occurs between individuals who maintain a romantic or sexual relationship. Next, we get into chapter 15, focusing on religion. Religion is a system of beliefs, values, and practices concerning what a person holds to be sacred or spiritually significant. Religious beliefs are specific ideas that members of a particular faith hold to be true. These can be socially constructed in the sense that different religions might have different religious beliefs, but all religions have some sort of religious beliefs. A religious experience is the conviction or sensation that one is connected to the quote-unquote divine. And then that often plays out in religious rituals, which is behaviors or practices that are either required for or expected of the members of a particular group. Continuing on with chapter 15 in our overview of religion, denomination is a large mainstream religion that is not sponsored by the state, which is very common here in the United States. And a lot of the sort of denominations we see here are rooted in Christianity and Judeo-Christian practices. And so we see how that influences other social institutions. For example, our work week or when we have to go to public schools is based off of that Judeo-Christian calendar and having Saturday and Sunday off. Liberation theology is the use of a church to promote social change via the political arena. We saw this a lot during the 1960s and 70s during the civil rights movement and the women's liberation movement, where churches really became a hub of social change and political change, especially if we think about like Black churches and that sort of thing. And then finally, we have atheism, which is the belief in no deities. And then I also included cults on here because your textbook authors define it in chapter 15. And it's often an idea that students are very interested in, especially because cult documentaries are more and more popular. So cults are religious groups that are small, secretive, and having a highly controlling membership and have this charismatic leader, which you can see in this image here. You got the charismatic leader with the disciples of that cult around them. And then finally, I'm going to end with some questions to get you thinking as we sort of get into our week 11 in-person session. These are questions that for my face-to-face class, students are doing in groups this week. So you might think about how definitions of family vary across cultures and religion, maybe in different parts of the United States, like the example I gave. You might think about how does the concept of the family life course challenge the idea of a traditional family life cycle? What role does kinship play in both family structures and religious communities? There's definitely a connection between religion and family as social constructs and social institutions. If we're thinking about intimate partner violence, we might ask the question, how might religion influence attitudes toward issues like cohabitation or intimate partner violence? And then finally, in what ways do religious rituals and beliefs reinforce family structures and expectations? I'll add the exit pass link here momentarily. Don't forget to finish reading chapters 14 and 15, and then start reading chapter 16 in preparation for week 12. Continue working on your group project. And don't forget, for our in-person class session Thursday evening this week, week 11, you'll be doing an activity. You'll need to submit your photos from that activity in order to earn your 10 points for your week 11 assignment. If you have any follow-up questions, feel free to email me. But other than that, I'll see you in person Thursday evening.